Hello and welcome back to this second episode, which is on the theme of stepping back from worried thinking. So I'm going to give a bit of insight into the nature of the mind and how we can sometimes get caught up in worried thinking, and indeed a bit more insight into a practice that we can use, a mindfulness practice that we can use just to bring ourselves back from that so that we can self-regulate and take ourselves back into a more balanced and peaceful place. As we heard about in the previous episode, the introduction to mindfulness session, our brains are wired to worry. And from an evolutionary perspective, this ordinary worrying habit of the mind makes complete sense. If the goal is to avoid getting eaten by a predator, which it was thousands of years ago, then living in a state of continuous vigilance or low-grade anxiety is an adaptive trait, essential for survival. But we no longer live in these prehistoric times. In our modern world, much of our worrying is about things like our finances, fear of making a mistake, fear of how others might perceive us, or in general fear that our lives might not turn out in the manner that we would like. Many of the worries that we have in our lives are a misuse of our imagination, made up of just stories in the mind of things that are unlikely to ever happen. But we catastrophise about them, and we get quite seduced by them, these thoughts in our minds. However, in light of what's arrived at our doorstep with current times, worries and fears have been heightened quite significantly for many people right now, and those worries can contribute to the build-up of stress in our system. And there are three main causes of stress, just building on what we covered in the introduction to mindfulness session. The first of which is not being able to control an outcome. We're all living in a time of unknowns where we can't predict what's going to happen and when this is going to end, so that means that we don't feel in control of things at the moment. Inability to predict the future is our second indicator that stimulates our stress response, and the third is the perception that something is going to get worse. And when we have any of those three variations, we trigger our primitive nervous system that needs to mobilise an enormous amount of energy to prepare ourselves for that imminent danger or threat. In the ancient past, it has always been better when you're faced with the unknown to run from it. That was the best chance of survival. But based on our modern day living, we want to, if we can, try to avoid running away from situations and more to have a greater sense of perspective and be able to really rationalise our thinking and what's going on in our mind, just to see if it is something that is genuinely a threatening situation, or whether it's something that we can apply some kind of a strategy to help us to step back from that worried thinking, which is what we're going to cover today. So as we keep switching on that system for an extended period of time, we live by this arousal of fear, the arousal of suffering or uneasiness of the mind, the arousal of aggression or anger or whatever it might be moving through the system, moving through our mind. And it takes energy to activate these latent systems. And when we do that, our immune systems are compromised because there's only a certain amount of energy available to run the immune system, to run the digestive system, both of which use up a lot of energy. So in that moment where we have started to engage in this worried thinking, we have triggered ourselves into this state which we may be aware of as fight or flight, the state of survival. The body has mobilised its resources internally, it's given us a big surge of energy to help us to deal with that threat. And by doing so, it's at the expense of the immune system. And so there is a suppression there of the immune system. And that can explain why sometimes when we're in high stress states or high worried states, and this is going on maybe over a prolonged period, that then the body can become unwell. We can get sick, we can get an illness of some sort. because our immunity has dropped in response to what's happening and in response to the stimulus that the body's getting from the mind. So when we're engaging in worried thinking, it means we've temporarily lost touch with the present moment. And this can be a familiar pattern that we've gotten into that becomes part of our autopilot response when we encounter any perceived danger. And our autopilot mode is where about 95% of the way we live our lives is coming from subconscious programming and neurocircuitry that has been developed over the course of our lives to this date. And if we were predisposed to any environments when we were younger or as we were growing that maybe felt unsafe, or there was any other kind of experience of something that scared us or frightened us, that can leave quite a strong impression on a young person, and that then becomes part of our subconscious mind and then can be part of our response when any other sort of similar situations unfold. We can quite quickly go straight into the worrying mind, and we can really start to feed more energy into those kind of thoughts, which gives them momentum, and the worries and the fears can build up to be more and more in our minds. So it's good for us to be able to have awareness of that, but the good news is that we can actually move beyond this, and we can actually create these new circuits in the brain, and that's something that we'll cover as I move on into the body of the session. So the other thing just to be aware of at this point is that when we when we've gone into this heightened state of alert, we've temporarily lost our ability to be rational. The mind takes over, and this is the mind that is being driven by the amygdala, which is the part of the brain which is where our stress response is triggered from, and it doesn't think, it just acts. So it's a very impulsive, instinctive thing, which means that in the moment we can't access our rational thinking brain, which is our prefrontal cortex. So when we're aware of that, we can do stuff to try and counteract that, to take us back out of that heightened state of alert. When we're a bit more caught in the grip of what's going on and a little bit unconscious at that point, it's harder for us to be able to pull ourselves back from that. And what's also happening at this point is the body is secreting chemicals from our from the nervous system, which correspond with the kind of thoughts we're having, so that the body can feel the way that we've been thinking. And this is how we can then get the feeling of anxiousness in the body, for example, because if we're having anxious thoughts and our mind is occupied with those, then the body will respond by giving us those associated feelings, just so that we can understand the way we've been thinking. So it's almost a signal from the body, but often we don't register the fact that it's the body giving us a signal. We just think, I feel anxious. This is where we're going to then have a look in seeing how we can rewire the brain almost with new circuits and recondition the mind to develop a greater level of control, so we can more easily step back from worried thinking. And in this next part, I'm going to describe how we can do that. So the process that we follow goes through some different stages, and the first part of that is to notice what's happening, and this is where we bring mindful attention to our worrying mind, and we just notice that the mind has slipped into this seductive state. It can be helpful to silently say into ourselves when we notice what the nature of the thinking is. So if it's worrying, we would just say worrying. And this labelling is done with a very light touch. Just silently, we're saying it into ourselves. The next part of the process is becoming present. And one of the cultivated disciplines of our mindfulness practice is to notice when we are caught up in thought and connect with our breath so we remain present with the experience as it's unfolding. So we would notice, and then we would go and check in with the breath. And while connecting with the breath, which brings us into the present moment and out of the thinking, worrying mind, we still have awareness of what's going on in the mind. So there may still be thoughts that are emerging, but we're just not at that point actively engaging in them. The next stage of the process is to step back from the story. So we're not trying to push thoughts away, because that's a form of focus. What we're trying to do is change from shifting from aversion to investigation. We're stepping back from what's happening, just observing and being curious to what is happening in the mind, and deciding not to actively engage in the thoughts. We're deciding not to prolong the story. And then the next stage of that is that we create space. By the very virtue of the fact that we've decided not to prolong the story and we're now in this state of observation, then this creates space between us and our thoughts, as if we're watching the thoughts. We're maybe sitting in a movie theatre watching the thoughts on the screen in front of us. So we're just watching the thoughts moving past as though they're on the movie screen in front of us. So this simple shift leads to the experience of what we call decentering, which is the experience of a slight disidentification with our worried minds. It's subtle, but this sense of space between us and our worries helps release the grip of worry, so we're not really, caught in the overwhelm of what's going on. We begin to see that these are just thoughts, and simply thoughts, just mental events passing through, and perhaps even we may draw perspective that this is just an echo from the past, something familiar, and not something that we need to overly engage with. And from that place, when we've managed just create a little bit more space between us and our thoughts, we can start to watch the coming and going from a place of greater peacefulness and ease. And the key during this process is to have a kind and gentle attitude towards ourselves while we become more skilled at it, because it may not happen overnight. We may not be able to just go through those steps and immediately master that. We might still be getting quite seduced by our mind's activity and caught up in that. But with intention and with practice, we can develop the skill over time. And for a lot of people, it's a life-changing transition. So this practice is what we call a bridge between our informal and formal mindfulness practice. The informal mindfulness practice is where we're becoming present in our everyday life activities, like brushing our teeth, preparing our coffee, preparing a meal, walking. These kind of activities that we can do really mindfully with intention to be really present, that is what we call informal mindfulness. And our formal mindfulness is our sitting meditation practice. So this is a bridge in between those two. And what this does is it switches us from our busy doing state into a state of being, a mindful being mode. And this allows us to interrupt the autopilot, because quite often if we've got our head down, focused on whatever it is that we've got to do in the day, we can find ourselves just moving from task to task, moving from conversation to conversation, and over time we're just operating through this autopilot, automatic way, not necessarily fully conscious of what we're doing, not always conscious of where the mind is taking us and how we're maybe reacting. So this is basically a process that allows us just to stop and step back, so we can go through these steps just to bring ourselves into a much more present, aware and peaceful state. So it allows us to check in with how we're feeling, because the things that are going on within the physical body are indicators of stress and other things that we may need in the moment. So when we do step off out of our doing state and just check in with that environment, we start to become much more connected with that environment and aware. And it might even be that we notice when we do that that we're halfway through the day and we realise we haven't hydrated the body, and we can go and take that action. It might be that we need to go and have a walk just to freshen ourselves up, just to give the brain a break, you know, and come back and feel much more kind of rejuvenated, more focused, and with a greater sense of energy as well, because sometimes our energy can dip at points during the day when we're really caught up in sort of the hectic activities of daily life. So the next stage of the process is to, as I mentioned earlier, just to connect in with the breath, brings us present. Step 2, and the final step of this process of the 3-step breathing space is just to then look outward and become much more aware of what's happening in the mind, what's happening in the body, what's there in the external environment. We're just opening up to the full sensory experience of the present moment, and then once we can resource ourselves, decide what it is we need to do, we can then move on with our day mindfully aware. So that's the introduction to the practice, and now I'm going to lead you through the practice of the 3-step breathing space. So just get nice and comfortable where you are. And all we need to do for this practice is to make sure that we feel comfortable first and foremost. So if you're in a seated position, just make sure that your back feels supported, nice elongated spine, chin tucked down ever so slightly, just to open this channel behind the back of the neck. Feet flat on the ground if possible, just so we get a sense of feeling grounded and connected. And at this point I would invite you to close your eyes, or if you don't want to close your eyes, that's okay, just maybe lower the gaze just to minimise the sensory input to the brain. And I'll start the practice with just checking in with our posture. Noticing how the body feels resting on the chair. And then just noticing how you are now. Becoming aware of any thought activity in the mind. Just observing. Noticing the coming and going of thoughts in the mind. And what the nature of those thoughts are. And noticing whether there's any emotion or mood present for you now. And whether there are any physical sensations anywhere within the body. So just checking in with how you are now. Thoughts, emotions, sensations in the body. And then switching focus to become aware of the breathing. Noticing the detailed sensations that come and go with this breath. Noticing where you can feel the breath within the body. maybe at the nostrils, maybe sensations of movement in the belly or the rib cage. Just following the breath and following the rhythm of the breath. And then spreading out your focus from the breath to become aware of the whole body. Allowing the body to be just as it is. And then spreading out your focus further to become aware of any activity in the mind. And again, with a sense of just allowing it to be just as it is. Becoming aware of the space surrounding the body. Any sense of warmth or coolness around the body. Sounds, ground beneath the body. And if the eyes have been closed, just gently opening those up to view the spaciousness around you. Opening up to your whole experience with a sense of allowing it to be just as it is. Engaging all the senses. And then moving on with your day, mindfully aware. So just gently bring yourself back out of that practice and give the body some movement, stretch, anything else that the body needs. Maybe a drink, if you've got something handy. So that practice essentially brings together the steps that I talked you through earlier in a way where we can step back from worried thinking, following a process. It's a methodical process that we can follow, and as we learn how to follow that in the moment, we don't even have to do it for a great length of time. We could maybe even just be a minute that we would take just to go through those steps of that process. Allows us to be able to restore some balance within mind and body, some perspective, and with that we can move forward with the intention to be present and mindfully aware. And the more that we do that, we're starting to be able to step back from some of these old habits and these circuits in the brain that keep taking us back down these familiar pathways of worried thinking. And when we start to do that and use this method that we've gone through, we start to see changes in the brain too, because we're not getting immediately swept away in some of these worried thoughts that we're having. And by doing that and learning how we can step back and just observe what's happening without getting tangled in the details, then it helps us to make a new choice, a new way of handling that situation, which means we don't act in the way perhaps we have in the past. And when we take a different route, we create new pathways in the brain. So it's a really powerful process where we can start to do that more skillfully with more practice. That's how we get better at it, is through the practice. The more mindfulness meditation we do, the more skilled we become at it, and the more benefits that we can derive from it. So I hope that's been useful, and any questions that you may have about this or anything else that you've heard on any of the videos, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can reach me at gary@themindfulenterprise.org, and I would hope to be back at some point in the future with another episode. Thank you.